It is Saturday, but we are still working for Crusoe. It is Saturday, March 23rd. He is Sam Park. I'm John Ramey. We are both in Los Angeles, and we are pleased to join you after a day's delay. Thank you for your patience. We will talk a lot about Russia. We were going to anyway today focus on the Russian election, but now this attack by Islamic State that has killed over 130 people will also draw our focus, and we will talk about the context of the attack within the larger geopolitical reality for Russia. But very quickly, first, we want to talk about the U.S. Central Bank. The Fed Chair Jerome Powell spoke to reporters after a meeting earlier this week. They did not change rates, Sam, and it looks like some of the inflationary pressures we talked about last week from the PPI, the Producer Price Index, those figures are, in fact, making the Fed a little bit reluctant to cut rates. Is that a fair characterization?
I would say so, although they insisted that they still intend to have 3 rate cuts this year. And so they're not backing off their general strategy, but inflationary pressures are lingering in the economy. And so, for instance, gas prices are rising again and things like that. So it seems that some commentators seem to think that their desire to reach the 2% target is just a little bit slimmer than it was before. And that works out well because, as we've said many times, it seems that last mile of towards the 2% target is going to be the hardest.
So the man himself, lead deadhead Chairman Powell, said, "quote We continue to make good progress bringing inflation down. We've got 9 months of 2.5% inflation, and now we've had 2 months of kind of bumpy inflation." That's a direct quote. Continuing the quote, "There are some bumps. And the question is, are they more than bumps? And we can't know that. That's why we are approaching this question carefully." Because in your exuberance to bring rates back down to what everybody wants them to be, you don't want to accidentally kick over an anthill and have it, well, I'm mixing my metaphors, but kick over an anthill and have the thing flame up again.
That's right. And it seems as though investors are catching up with where the Fed is at. Right. They're no longer disappointed that they're not going to have rate cuts immediately. And so if their expectations can be brought into alignment a little closer, I think that's probably a good thing. The other thing is that the Fed seems wary of there being a recession, which is, I think, is what you were trying to imply there. And of course, nobody wants a recession, but it was thought for a long time that might have been the price of bringing inflation to heel. And it seems as though they're just cautious about that. I think to some extent, so many people have said that they might actually be able to avoid a recession, and that's seemed to be an increasing likelihood that they'd really like to have it that way.
Powell also said in his comments, and I'm paraphrasing here, but that it's evident there's some persistent price pressures in housing and the services sector. And when I first read that, my reaction was, duh. But
sure.
then my next reaction was, well, I suppose it's a good thing if the head of the central bank can report that he is experiencing or seeing evidence of the same economic realities that, like, rank and file consumers might understand.
Yeah, exactly. And you do need to mention these things, right? He actually just needs to demonstrate that they're aware of him, right? For instance, I would have preferred that, for instance, when he talks about the services sector, one of those services is insurance, right? And insurance rates
I'm glad you brought that up, Sam.
Very high. And everybody hates insurance because it's something that you have to buy.
You have to buy it. It's expensive. And then when you need it, they try to get out of paying you.
That's right. And you have to buy it with the hope that you will never have to use it, right? It's very unusual in the service sector or the entire economy. It's something you have to buy that you never want to have to use. And so that's, and it's very expensive. And going up all the time. And this is a big deal, right? I think this is one of the most important factors in why consumer expectations of inflation are declining. which they are. That is why they're sticking around, although they are declining. But the good news is consumer expectations of inflation are declining very slowly, not just here, but in many other countries.
So does that mean when I paid $4.50 for a regular cup of coffee in the Reno airport yesterday, and my displeasure dissipated quicker? Is that my consumer expectation or my consumer acquiescence or acclimatization to the new market? Is that me getting
I
used
guess
to
it
it?
might be. I mean,
Yeah.
how do you feel about that price
Well, I
right now?
didn't feel about it for very long. Like initially, I thought that sucked, and then I thought, I guess that's just what we're paying for coffee now.
Yeah,
Yeah.
honestly, because in an airport, I
I know it's
might
a
have
bargain to get
expected,
it under $5,
right?
I thought.
I might have expected that to be a $6 cup of coffee. Frankly,
Well, the
that doesn't.
Reno Airport's okay.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure.
That's another episode, rating
Yes.
airport price index.
Yeah, you know what? That one actually might be pretty good. Although
Well, I have a lot of
doing,
firsthand data.
I understand that, but we wanted to make it a little bit broader than your own personal travels,
Fair
John.
enough.
Or in fact, a lot broader.
Yeah, that's probably a better service to our viewers and listeners. Okay. Any other thoughts on the Fed?
No, I think we can move on to actually one. I mean, one of the countries in which consumer expectations of inflation is declining is Russia. So that might provide us with a good pivot point there.
Let's start with the attack because this is so shocking and inherently newsworthy. This morning, Reuters is reporting that Islamic State has released a photograph of what they claim were the four attackers behind the massacre, the shooting rampage that killed what Reuters says now is 143 people at least
Oh
in a
my God.
concert hall on the outskirts of Moscow yesterday. Islamic State claims responsibility for the attack, but there are reports that Russia is trying to pursue a Ukrainian link to the attack, which I guess is expected, despite emphatic denials from Ukrainian officials. Islamic State's beef with Russia is something that has flown under the radar, I think is fair to say.
Oh, I wouldn't
And
know about that. It's just kind of
well,
fallen out of the headlines.
sure, we don't think about Russia's involvement in the Syrian civil war too much because there's a lot of other newer, frankly, deadlier, well, maybe not deadlier, but certainly more headline grabbing conflicts going on. And that's the root of this, right? Ostensibly,
Well,
Russia, Syria,
ostensibly,
and then Islamic State, which is in the Levant.
sure, and but it's like you say, it's really just that it's fallen off the top of the news cycle,
And I
right?
will point out that's a problem with the internet. There's no page two. The internet
Right,
is everything
exactly.
above the
Yeah,
fold in a million point font headline.
yeah. But back during when the Syrian civil war was really raging, you used to hear about this with a fair amount of regularity, right? It was a pretty well covered news story, I would say, back
Sure, there's
then. But that was
chemical weapons involved.
Yeah,
I mean, it's terrible.
that was 10 years ago, though,
Yeah.
right? I mean, and so in some ways, perhaps Islamic State sort of felt like they weren't getting enough coverage, right? Because when was the last time you heard about them doing much of anything? And whereas for a while they were the big scary thing in the news for the West,
100%.
right? And
100%.
now they're really not. Now it's all Cold War. And so
Sam, I don't know if I can live in a world where like a terrorist group butchers 140 people for clout. I mean, or is that what terrorism is?
But that's what it is, right? I
Right.
mean, but the thing is, you don't have to even have to be a terrorist group. I remember shortly after Kim Jong Un took power in North Korea, which again was a number of years ago. Uh, the first thing he did was uh, purge his internal enemies, right? Now, John, I think everybody can relate to that. It's something that once you start doing it, you
You get
find it
used to it.
quickly. Yeah, you quickly takes up all your time, right? And we've all been there. And so, but it suddenly occurred to him that he was falling off the charts of the scary table, right? And so suddenly he started launching all these missiles and doing all these things because other people had sort of taken his top slot. So you don't have to be a terrorist organization necessarily. These are just things that that people do to flex their muscles. It's terrible. right? Don't misunderstand me. I don't mean to make light of it, but it's not all that unusual, unfortunately.
Okay, so my first reaction, and again, I am not a diplomat, my first reaction was, is this a gift, a horrific, lethal gift from Islamic State to the West? Because the West can now say to Vladimir Putin, hey, buddy, you got to stop fighting your silly war because your internal security is so terrible that ISIS can just shoot up your people. Let's work on an off ramp. Or is that way too optimistic?
I think that's way too optimistic, frankly. I mean, although the United
Do you
States is
see what I
saying,
mean, though? There is an opportunity
I
for
do
Russia to get
understand.
on side.
I do understand what you're saying. I think that's one of the problems with this is that we quickly get into this sort of Byzantine, web of incentives over a an event that's actually probably much simpler than that, right? And in fact, we know that the United States actually warned the Russians, right, that they
and the general public.
yes, that they suspected that terrorists were planning a mass casualty event, especially around something like a concert hall, right? Or
there was an announcement like 2 weeks ago on a
that's right.
website of the embassy, the U.S. embassy.
That's right. The U.S. embassy, exactly, in Moscow. And so, and the other thing about it is that people seem to be afraid that Russia is now going to ramp up their operations in Ukraine as a result of this. They're trying to blame Ukraine for this even right now. And honestly, what I would say about that is they were going to ramp those operations up anyway. They were going to bring to bear all the resources that they could bring to bear anyway. This actually isn't going to hasten that, I would guess. Anyway, I'm not a military guy, but I think, it's like, why would you be holding back?
Right.
I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I see your point. Like we in the West probably then want to attach a whole bunch of things to this and maybe the immediate aftermath that Russia wouldn't be interested in pursuing.
Right. I mean, if Islamic State are maniacs, right? They're terrible. But the thing is,
right.
They hate every country, right? They're against the idea of having countries at all.
They hate the Taliban in Afghanistan.
Exactly, because the Taliban only wants to govern a country, right? Whereas for Islamic State, that's no good, right? There should just be one worldwide caliphate, and that would be the Islamic State. They want to be the entire government of the world. It's insane, but we shouldn't be surprised if they attack any country because they hate the idea of countries.
Okay. So we have Islamic State telling Reuters, right? Islamic State has showed photographs to the world of these are our guys. They did it. The United States has said this checks out.
Yeah.
Will rank and file people in Russia ever know that Islamic State is taking credit for this? Like, I don't know, and I don't think we actually know, but how much of the reality of the responsibility of this attack will filter through the kind of Iron Dome media propaganda sphere that exists inside the Russian society?
No, that's an excellent point, and I don't think we can know the answer to that question. Now, Putin has made a statement, and he seemed to acknowledge that this was Islamic State, but he's still trying to link it to Ukraine. He's saying that the people who've been apprehended were headed for Ukraine from Moscow while they were apprehended. You could have been going anywhere, right? I mean, that's not a short distance. Just ask Yevgeny Prigozhin, except you can't because he's dead. And so they're trying to say it's about Ukraine anyway. So, and in terms of what people might think, I think the first thing they'll think is our nation is under attack, right? I don't think they're going to necessarily care all that much. I will say though that many other commentators have already said this, so it shouldn't be any surprise. It does make Putin look weak, right? Because this is the most serious internal terrorist attack they've had inside Russia in quite some time.
Since his possible false flag Chechen attack early in his first term, back around the turn of the millennium?
That was even before he was.
That's when he was about to become
the prime minister. That he was. But many people would say that it was his response to that attack that actually brought him to power,
and brought Russia further into an autocratic kind of reality.
Certainly, and so here we are, 25 years later. He's still in power, and this kind of thing is still happening. Whereas,
I guess people will tolerate autocracy as long as they're safe.
That should be the entire point. Although
that's the exchange.
The thing is, if you're a full-on totalitarian as opposed to a run-of-the-mill autocrat, it never works out that way. Okay, suddenly your nation is at war, and you have internal enemies that constantly need to be purged. That's the difference between being a full-on totalitarian and a run-of-the-mill authoritarian up to fascist, right? And this is an idea that, John, as you well know, that I myself have gleaned from the reading of The Origins of Totalitarianism by the great scholar Hannah Arendt, which was Hannah Arendt, I should say, that was published in about 1950. And I would recommend to anybody that they read it, but the ideas contained therein are much too lengthy and complicated to be discussed in this format.
Not everybody has had Sam Park to read it for them and then explain it to them. So I have been very fortunate that you have done that scholarship.
Well, I mean, honestly, I've been hearing about it my whole life. I didn't actually read it until 2020, but I've not stopped thinking about it since.
And we have not stopped talking about it.
Well, seriously, almost every day something happens that brings those ideas to mind.
So, illustrative of the difference between autocracy and totalitarianism, the Russian election.
Yes.
Okay, so presidential elections were held in Russia between the 15th and 17th of March, so last weekend. 8th presidential election in the country's history. Vladimir Putin won 88% of the vote. Nobody thinks this was a free and fair election. Okay. But the fascinating thing for me was reading about the vestigial, pure facade, pure theater of kabuki democratic. They're playing pretend that it's an election. There were 3 other candidates on the ballot, including former member of the Duma, the Russian legislature. And then there were rejected candidates, including a guy named Boris Nadezhdin, who collected the required 105,000 signatures, but only 95,000 of those 105,000 required signatures were accepted. He appealed to the Russian Supreme Court. They ruled against him. So this guy is like, also he's a avowed anti-war candidate.
Yes.
Right? He's had a political ally killed, but he's not dead. Some kind of people leaking from the Kremlin are like, this poor guy thinks he's running for president, but he's just setting himself up for treason charges. But you have these kind of fake hologram pseudo-democratic things. And all I could think about was, this is what it'll be like here if Trump gets reelected. We're not going to not have a Supreme Court. We're not going to not have a legislative branch, but the executive is just going to undermine or attempt to undermine all these institutions all the time.
100%. Yeah. I think Nadezhdin, he probably was legit, right? He probably did sincerely mean these things, and he might have even understood that in the end, he would only amount to a sort of Potemkin candidacy, right? But he just felt like he had to do it anyway. And that's the shame of it all, really, is that, because he really did enable Putin to sort of sit there and say, see, we're not just, but
the anti-war candidate can't even get the required number of signatures.
Right. But every autocratic nation that we can think of actually does have elections, right? Just about, right? Syria had them, right? Saddam Hussein had them in Iraq, right? And it's a sort of gesture, right? And because what you want is an overwhelming result in favor of the ruler, right?
And no autocrat calls themselves a dictator or an autocrat. They're always the president of.
That's
or
right.
generally they're the president, and then they win by 88% of the vote. You know what else I
Exactly.
found hilarious, for lack of a better term, is that all these other candidates have political parties. Vladimir Putin is independent.
That's right. He does
I'm
not
like, the
belong to a
dude's
political
just like,
party. Yeah,
I don't need a party. I've just got all the money and the muscle.
that's right. And to reference Hannah Arendt once again, uh, one of the things that she says in The Origins of Totalitarianism is the one that I found perhaps the most disturbing, right? Is that totalitarianism never succeeds without the support of what she called the masses, right? Now, keep in mind that she wrote this book in the middle of the 20th century. We didn't have advanced polling data and things like this, that people were sifting through. And also, she was a sort of post-Marxist European intellectual. So when she says the masses,
She means the
she means it
proletariat.
in that sort of sense, right? And so I think that if she were operating today, she might revise that a little bit, right? Because it's not like everybody supports the totalitarian. It's just that lots of people do. And this is something that I think people need to understand about Putin's Russia. Sure, he manipulates the elections in his own country. He probably doesn't have to. He'd probably win anyway, right? So the point is not to win, right? It's to win overwhelmingly, right? To have the official result be that you just crushed the entire opposition, because
Right.
winning, it's
And
not
you
actually
don't,
about democratic victory.
sorry, but you don't kill Boris Nadezhdin, the anti-war candidate.
That's
You
right.
just don't let him get on the ballot in a
Exactly.
technicality. But you don't,
Yeah.
like, if it were a totalitarian state, Nadezhdin would be dead
He might be, sure. Yeah.
or
I
in
mean,
prison, right?
yeah,
Like
exactly.
Navalny, like there's a difference here, right?
Yes,
You
that's
maybe
right.
you let one guy still kind of talk a little bit and you don't kill him straight away, but then you let a technicality in your rigged Supreme Court, we assume, sink his candidacy. So then you can say,
Absolutely.
look,
Yeah.
this is what the people wanted.
Yes, but the other thing, though, I would say is that Putin has sort of advanced towards a totalitarian agenda steadily throughout his career, right? For instance, it's only in the past 2 years that he's actually launched a full-on artillery war against a neighboring country. Now, of course, he launched military operations against Ukraine 10 years earlier, or 10 years ago, I should say, and sort of lower level things against Georgia back in 2008. But this is a step further. And now he's, I would say, advancing towards totalitarianism. And again, Hannah Arendt mentioned that even the Second World War, from the point of view of Hitler, was only the totalitarian attempt, right? It was not a fully successful totalitarian regime, because the regime that Hitler meant to establish was not Germany, it was the world, or at a minimum, the entirety of Europe.
Speaking of autocrats and belligerent aggression, you sent me a very good piece by Ruth Ben-Ghiat from Lucid, a newsletter.
Yes, Ben-Ghiat is a professor at New York University and also the author of a very successful book called Strong Men, From Mussolini to the Present. I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners have seen her on television, where she appears quite frequently.
So I loved how she characterized and also cited Peter Pomerantsev's characterization that the conflict in Ukraine is not just about Russian expansion, but the empowerment of, quote, a whole network of authoritarian regimes and their wars against human rights, truth, humanitarianism, protection of children and women from trafficking, and a war against a reduction of reliance on fossil fuels. And she goes on to make the argument that inherent in any autocracy, and we're seeing this manifest with belligerent Russia, it's all about plundering the economy, stripping it of its assets, right? That's why you have this oligarchic band of the Russian society, because they stripped all the assets off the Soviet state and have essentially enriched themselves in the subsequent 30 years. And now Russia is trying to strip mine Ukraine of everything they can take. And also in this piece, there is a link to a report in Foreign Policy that the Estonian foreign ministry thinks Russia is now ramping up for a longer term war well beyond Ukraine and is kind of trying to establish a permanent or a long term wartime footing for their economy, for their manufacturing, etc. Basically saying, look out, they're whether it's today, tomorrow, whatever, if they get through Ukraine, NATO's next. And Estonia would be rather perfectly positioned to be sensitive and aware to those kind of things.
Sure. Well, they're a next door neighbor. They're right there on the Baltic, and they're a tiny country. It would take about a day for the Russian military to overrun them. And of course, they're a former Soviet country so they're very sensitive to things like this. But in fact, the wartime economy in Russia is not doing all that badly. They've got a lot of inflation. Actually, their inflation rate is about 7.5%, which, if that were the case here, there'd be riots. But they've got very little unemployment, as you might expect, right? Because
everybody's making shells.
Well, yeah, not just that, but 300,000 people are either dead or wounded from the Ukrainian war. However many hundreds of thousands more are still fighting there, and perhaps 100,000 or more left at the beginning of the war, and those are generally working age population, right? The other thing also is that Russia is a rapidly aging society. Their life expectancy is not very high, but also there are a lot of very old people. And those people actually remember that is the elderly people, remember what things were like after the Soviet Union fell, with the economic situation awful, much worse than it is today. And they vote, right? Just like in many other countries. The older you are, the more likely you are to vote, right? So they probably still do support Putin, right? The economic hard times that they've been going through because of Western sanctions, which is a real thing, right? There has been some hardship. It's nothing compared to what it was like 30 years ago inside Russia. This is, I would say, a firm base of Vladimir Putin's support is people who remember the immediate aftermath of the end of the Soviet Union.
Also in this article, it's pointed out that the Russians are being propped up by both Iran and North Korea in terms of military supplies and just the infrastructure of war, whereas Ukraine isn't getting any aid from the United States because the Republican Party has held up our Congress from sending aid. And now ammunition's being rationed in Ukraine.
That's right. It has been for about a month, I would say. It's a terrible situation.
Is it at a crisis point, Sam? Like, are we in danger of, I guess Russia doesn't need to wipe out Ukraine urgently because Putin's probably betting on Trump winning, and then he can take his time.
The thing is, I think that he would prefer to make as much headway as he can before the election,
just in case Biden wins.
Right? Absolutely, because Biden could win, and if that happened, and Trump and Putin had just sort of sat on his hands for all this year, he'd regret that, right? I think he'd want to go into whichever administration takes office next year here with as much of Ukraine as he can possibly have in his pocket. Now, that's just, my opinion. I'm not a military guy again, so I could be wrong about that. But it would seem to be in his interest to just move as quickly as he can, regardless.
Again, we're not a politics podcast, but I want to believe, perhaps naively, that enough Republicans in the United States, not elected officials, like regular people who are watching college basketball this weekend, understand it would be a colossal failure of American foreign policy to let a belligerent Russia roll through Ukraine and start a war with NATO, when we have the power to stop that. We have the power to take non-escalatory preventative steps from that calamity. It seems unthinkable that we would sit on our hands and allow that to happen.
Look, I agree with you 100%. The problem, though, is that I think that the Republican Party and perhaps large portions of its base, right? Those people that you talk about watching March Madness right now, right? There, I think, has been a real move towards isolationism. And part of that, I think, is just because of the catastrophe of
Yes.
the war in Iraq, right? Where it was, fully the project of a Republican president, right? And it went terribly. And
It's the
I
worst
think
foreign policy decision the United States has made since the end of the Second World War.
I would say so, yes. But I think Vietnam might have actually been worse, frankly. But
I might not,
okay,
but I
fine.
wasn't alive.
It
Yeah.
cost more American lives than just to begin with. Anyway, there's not a
Right. But the
ranking.
fact that it's a debate tells you it's terrible.
Okay, that's right. And I think it's important to remember that the Republican president who actually turned the Republican Party into an internationalist party was Dwight Eisenhower. And there's a story from when he was entering politics as a former general, as you'll recall, right? Either party would have been happy to have him as their
Yes, they were both
nominee.
courting him.
They both courted him. And the story goes that the reason he decided to run as a Republican was because if he figured that if he was not the Republican nominee, that nominee would have been Ohio Senator Robert Taft, who was very conservative and, by today's standards, very isolationist. He did not support the United States joining the United Nations as a full member. He did not support the NATO treaty. And of course, by the time of the 1952 election, Eisenhower had already served as supreme commander of NATO forces, and he was very pro-NATO, as you might expect. And Taft also was conservative enough that he drafted and passed the anti-union Taft-Hartley Act in the late 1940s. And so Eisenhower wanted to make sure that in the 1952 election, both parties would be internationalist. And now, I'm not generally one to go in for sort of historical hero worship, right? But the fact
Eisenhower's a fine candidate.
That there are points in history when individual decisions made by individual people have enormous consequences. And I would say this is one of them. But the point I'm making here is that Taft was very influential. I bring up the Taft-Hartley Act because he passed that through Congress over the veto of then President Harry Truman. And so it's not just that he was very conservative, but he was a very effective and powerful politician. Had he been able to win the presidency in 1952, he could have very dramatically altered the direction of the country in many different ways.
There could have been no Pax Americana. There could have been no civil rights movement, or
the New Deal could have been rolled back. I mean, so many different things could have happened.
So Dwight Eisenhower's choice to be a Republican and therefore an internationalist candidate and eventual two-time president kept the Republican Party internationalist until 2016.
I would say so, yes. But
Thanks, Ike.
It seems as though that isolationist strain in the Republican Party never actually went away. Or if it did, it was shockingly easy to bring back.
And speaking of basketball, to quote Rick Pitino, or to paraphrase him, Dwight Eisenhower's not walking through that door today.
No. I mean, thankfully, we don't have a government shutdown, but no one would have been surprised if we had had one. That's the Republican Party today. They're not even interested in having a government.
The world is so dangerous right now. It is essential that the conservative party, whatever it is in the United States, is not inward looking.
Well, you know what? I mean, we're going to have to get used to that. That's going to be the case for quite a while. I think almost no matter what happens.
Okay. We've covered the election, we've covered the war, we've covered the terrible terrorist attack in Russia. We've talked about the Fed. What are we looking at for next week, Sam Park?
Honestly, I can't really say. But one thing I would look at is the idea that perhaps all this craziness in Russia and the avoidance of a government shutdown and the challenge to the speakership of Mike Johnson in the House of Representatives, this could actually shake Ukraine aid loose. That's a real live ball on the field, I would say. So I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it in a weird way, it just sort of feels like it could, just because all these other things have sort of cornered it. And so that's something I'm going to be keeping an eye on. But I'm sure there's going to be some other crazy thing that will happen between now and then that we'll need to talk about. Also, the Middle East. We haven't actually talked about that in a while, and there do seem to be developments there on a sort of political level that are at least worth taking a look at.
Deepwater port being built in Gaza so the United States can supply the very people that are being attacked by the weapons the United States is giving the other side. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I just want to point out, and this is not like a criticism I encounter of this podcast, but I am self-consciously aware that Sam and I both are center left. We did spend a lot of time on Dwight Eisenhower today, and I think Sam and I would both lavish a lot of praise on Dwight Eisenhower politically.
I don't know about a lot, but plenty.
I would.
Right?
I enjoy the interstate highway system.
Sure, but also in
I enjoyed him not rolling back the New Deal.
Yeah, his role in determining the direction of the Republican Party, I admire him for that greatly. There's no question about it.
And, figures in history, wins World War II, two-term president, and sets up the Pax Americana that is only now starting to crumble. That's pretty, as you say, great man of history theory has its flaws, but Dwight Eisenhower certainly is a candidate for that argument. All right, enough history. He's Sam Park. I'm John Ramey from Los Angeles. Have yourselves a great weekend, and we'll talk to you next Friday.
So long, bud.